Welcome to Mysterious Universe, Season 32, Episode 1. Coming up on the show, we've got the Invisible Invaders, the Faux-manoids, and Jack Kelley joins us to discuss his brand new documentary, The Atlantis Puzzle. I'm your host, Benjamin Grundy. Joining me is Aaron Wright.
I'm looking forward to this interview. I haven't actually seen the full documentary yet, but I was skipping through it, and some of the stuff that's put forward is pretty, it's got some revelations in it, let's say that.
Skipping through it, wow. Really prepped for the show. Skipping through it.
I had to prep for the Plus extension. Look at all this. Look at all this stuff coming up.
I just watched the first 15 seconds of the trailer, and I looked at some of the pictures of the posters.
No, I had it playing in the background as I was preparing for today's show, and I really like, what's it called? I wrote it down here.
What's
it's
it called?
The Richer structure in Mauritania.
That's a spoiler.
Oh, is it a spoiler? Oh,
yeah, don't give away the spoilers. No, I did this interview with Jack. Great guy, really intelligent guy, really fun to talk to. I did the interview a couple of weeks ago, and this is...
Yeah, you sprung it on me.
Yeah, this is the first film he's... Yeah, and to Aaron's credit, I did send it to him like late yesterday saying, I watched this documentary, we're going to talk about it tomorrow. But he expected the film to release in August. And
so why is it being released now?
He said it just went through all the... because it's on Amazon Prime.
Oh, so like all their hoops that you've got to...
Well, they expected it to be a long approval process, but it just went straight through and it was live immediately. So we emailed,
so it's available now.
It's available now. He
Right.
emailed me straight away. You can find them at empireproductions.com. I'll link to everything in the show notes, of course, at mysteriousuniverse.org. But the film is The Atlantis Puzzle. You can find it in Amazon Prime, of course, but it's also, I think, on YouTube Movies, and we'll put a couple more links in
all
the
the
show
services
notes.
will be in the links.
But yeah, he emailed me and said, it's live. Put the interview out, because I was expecting to release this in a couple of weeks in August. But yeah, fantastic film. I really enjoyed it. Let's play a little bit of the trailer and take a look. This is not your average Crystals and Dinosaurs Atlantis documentary.
No.
Let's take a listen.
Atlantis, a lost continent that allegedly sank beneath the waves. Ancient Greek manuscripts written by Plato are the myth's source. But what if the story we think we know is wrong? For the first time, fresh research and new translations are revealing long misunderstood facts that transform Atlantis from fantasy into an incredible reality. Join me on a journey across continents and centuries as together we uncover the truth behind the Atlantis Puzzle.
Pretty cool. And a lot of it centers around this researcher. It's funny, in the interview, I say he's a researcher from Greek. I'm such an idiot.
Don't worry about it.
And because it's video, I can't edit it now. I just have to...
So all the years of covering up your audio mistakes are just being revealed
In
out
the
there.
past, I would just re-record it. So
Of
it
course.
sounds normal, like
Yeah.
I'm not an idiot. But now I just got to leave it in. But here he is on the screen here. This is George Sarantitis.
Sarantitis, sorry.
And he's an engineer by trade, but by all accounts, a bit of a polymath, a genius. And it's because of his research that this documentary exists. And Jack will tell you the story in the interview in a moment, but he claims that George really has cracked this, that there was a kind of almost a code left behind in Plato's commentaries. And it's been mistranslated in a major, major way. So you'll discover quite early on that we've been looking in the wrong place for Atlantis for hundreds of years.
Yeah, absolutely we have. And I think, to be fair though, much of the literature and attention that focuses on Atlantis out there goes back to the more, I guess, metaphysical style researchers. You've got, Casey and his depictions of it. I think even, Blavatsky was describing Atlantis. A lot of that stuff is all very like, crystalline power technologies and highly advanced, super civilizations. And I think in some sense, this documentary goes, quite a long way to show us that that's actually not what was going on. Atlantis may have actually been real, but it's not this kind of manufactured version of what we think Atlantis really is.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to having a discussion with you about the film after we play the interview. And I know that you've done more than watch the first 10 minutes. I know that you've watched most of the documentary. So here's the interview. We hope you enjoy it. This is Jack Kelley. He's the director of the new film, The Atlantis Puzzle. We're welcoming to the show Jack Kelley. He's the director and star of the new documentary, The Atlantis Puzzle. Thanks so much for your time, Jack. Thanks for joining us.
Ben, thanks for having me.
Yeah, the movie was absolutely fantastic. I just finished watching it last night, and I was just blown away by the puzzle that's uncovered throughout this film. You've paired with this brilliant researcher out of Greek, George Sarantitis. Am I getting his surname right? Sarantitis?
Yeah, Sarantitis. Yep, that's right.
I want to get into his research because this is really the core of the entire film, what George has uncovered. But first, let's find out about you. Give us a bit of your background. How did you get involved in this project? Have you been making films for very long?
Yeah, so it's quite funny. Like many things in life, I stumbled into this totally by accident. Never set out to make a movie about Atlantis. I wasn't scouring the globe for research or anything like that. I studied ancient history, philosophy, literature, language at Yale, as well as architecture, and came out with a degree in architecture. So I've always had a deep passion for ancient history and the classical world. I had read The Myth of Atlantis before. I totally missed it. I thought it was just another dry political kind of allegory by Plato. And I didn't really think anything of it for quite a long time. So I had a career on Wall Street. I quit. I burned out about 10 years ago. Moved to LA, started my own film production company. So I kind of have a few different companies I keep my hands in, but what I'm really passionate about storytelling, passionate about ancient history, and I hope to make more successive documentaries, kind of exploring some ancient mysteries from a more critical thinking perspective, let's say.
And has the myth of Atlantis always been something that you've been fascinated with, or is this just a recent pursuit for you?
I thought it was nonsense. I thought that the myth of Atlantis had nothing to teach me at all, and I could not have been more wrong. The research that went into this film, The Atlantis Puzzle, which should be coming out later this summer, totally opened my eyes in a new way to a lot of different subjects about both history and prehistory.
Well, you point out early on that the myth of Atlantis has been reshaped by pop culture in such a huge way. Because when we talk about Atlantis on the show, I was telling you before the interview, we're talking about crystal pyramids and people that remember past lives and all sorts of crazy stuff like dinosaurs and things like that. If you look into Atlantis, there is some wild, insane stories. And this has kind of built up over the years in layers, hasn't it? And it's almost far removed from the original tale from Plato, right?
100%. I mean, I ask people, hey, what's the first thing that pops into your mind when you think about the myth of Atlantis? And it's always something to do with a lost civilization sunken beneath the waves, maybe some UFOs, maybe some free energy and flying cars thrown in for good measure, perhaps some reptilian, half-human creatures or something like that. And what you realize, like when I went back to look into this, is that Atlantis is sort of the king of the fringe theory things, right? I mean, this is the Godzilla or King Kong of fringe theory stuff. And I think one of the fascinating elements about it is that the story has persisted for 2,400 years, right? So, I mean, this is right up there in terms of staying power with stuff like the Iliad and the Odyssey and, other ancient tales, Aesop's fables and stuff like that. So that alone is pretty remarkable. But as you mentioned, so many different spins have been put on this by Hollywood. I mean, what do we got now? Aquaman is, flying around fighting people with a trident, and he's, sailing a chariot drawn by sharks or something like that. I mean,
You pointed out in the film that whenever there's a archaeological discovery anywhere in the world that happens to be underwater, it's always accompanied by the headline, Atlantis found, ? So it really is the go-to, isn't it? Yeah. Well, let's go back. Let's go back to the original description from Plato's commentaries and maybe revisit the origin of the story, because I guess most of us listening understand this goes back to the Egyptian priest speaking to Solon in the 6th century BCE. But what's the what's the flow on from that to eventually, I understand, it's like 200 years later, to Plato writing about it? How did it finally make its way to Plato?
Right there, right at the start, man, we've got a perplexing thing because Timaeus and Critias, two books written by Plato that sort of encapsulate the Atlantis story, were written by Plato probably around, let's say, somewhere in like 380 BC, maybe 360 BC, that time window. And but here's the thing: he's describing a conversation that happened among four dudes: Socrates, Critias, Timaeus, and Hermocrates. Plato's not there. How'd he hear about it? Well, somebody must have told him about the conversation, if in fact it took place, which I'm 99% sure it didn't, because Hermocrates was a general for Syracuse that had recently defeated an Athenian task force in the second phase of the Peloponnesian War. So it's a bit like if General Patton was hanging out in post-World War II Berlin with Himmler. I mean, having a chat about philosophy, it didn't happen. So you have what's basically kind of a fictional setup within the dialogue, but using some real people. But there's a little bit of play right there. And so the story is basically, everybody is sort of hanging around. They say, Socrates, you gave such a great speech yesterday. A lot of people think this refers back to Plato's Republic. And we want to thank you, so we're going to give speeches now. And Critias says, Socrates, when you were talking about the ideal society, I couldn't help but think it reminded me of this story I heard from my grandpa. His name was also Critias. And his dad told it to him, and his name was Dropides. And he was best buddies with Solon, who was a real person and who was sort of this kind of primary lawgiver for the Athenian city-state in Greece. The story is that after Solon set up the laws of the Athenian city-state, because he was this kind of founding father figure, I love this part that nobody ever talks about. He took off for 10 years to go travel because he didn't want people bothering him and asking him to change the laws, which I just think is brilliant. A minor piece of comedy that nobody fully appreciates. Yeah. This guy
change the laws and leave the room and don't elaborate. Just get out of there.
Getting out while the getting was good. So he went off on like a 10-year sabbatical, and he winds up, at the Temple of Sais in the Egyptian Nile Delta, which was a real place. It was a real temple. And that temple is currently kind of in a ruinous state. It's sort of sunken into the Nile Delta over thousands of years, right? So apparently he sort of Solon is there. He says, "I'm gonna talk up these these Egyptian priests and tell them what we Greeks know about the ancient past." So he starts doing that. Lays out what the Greeks know, and inevitably, as he goes back in history, it starts to get semi-mythical, and then it kind of gets very mythical, right? And he takes it all the way back to a couple of great flood events that the Greeks had in their mythology, one of which is the flood of Deucalion, where kind of, the world was repopulated. It was, in that way, a bit analogous to a Noah's Ark kind of story. And the Egyptians just start like laughing at him. They're just like, you're a dope. You only know a couple thousand years of history at tops. We Egyptians know it all because we got it all written down in our temples here. But you guys, you Greeks, every time there's a big disaster or, a big war, there's some kind of famine or society falls apart, and you guys basically go back to zero and you start over. But we here in Egypt, we're stable. We got a very stable society. We've been here for thousands of years. In fact, we've been here for at least 8,000 years, right in this spot. And I'm going to, just to show you how much more we know than you, I'm going to tell you a story that you don't even know about your own ancestors. And this story took place 9,000 years ago, so about 9,600 BCE. And it was back when you Athenians, let's call them Proto-Athenians, you defeated this mighty evil empire, the Atlanteans, and they had swept across North Africa, conquering everybody. They enslaved us, poor Egyptians, and a lot of other people, and they also took over the Western Mediterranean, kind of halfway up Italy. And but you guys drove them back, and you fought your way all the way back. You counterattacked, went all the way to the Atlantean capital city. And you were about to stick it to them, but suddenly there was a horrific, storm and flood and an earthquake, and overnight, in a single kind of day and night, your entire army, along with the whole Atlantean capital city, was utterly destroyed. And the Greek actually says something like, "Your army was swallowed up by the earth." So that's kind of the story.
Yeah, and with those modern twists on it, how everything's been distorted with pop culture, we often forget that it really was a war. It's a story describing this great war, the ancestors of the Athenians fighting off these invaders from another civilization. And this brings us to people like Ignatius Donnelly in the 19th century, one of the first researchers to really put forward this idea that has become the meme, that this was a continent that sunk. Talk about his theory, and then let's get on to George, because George, again, is really the central part of the documentary. He didn't agree with this idea from Ignatius. Why didn't he think that this idea of a sunken continent is something worth pursuing?
Right. So just super briefly, Donnelly gets made fun of a lot today, and everyone says he's a dope or he's a racist or he's a this or that. Guy wrote his book in 1882. What was going on in 1882? Well, Flinders Petrie, the father of modern archaeology, had just gotten going in his career, right? Archaeology was just establishing itself as a science. Troy and Mycenae had recently been uncovered by Heinrich Schliemann, or were in the process of being uncovered. So there was this ecstatic excitement among people who had a passion for the classical world and the ancient world, who said, my God, Troy, a lot of people thought was a myth. It was real. Oh my gosh, Mycenae, we thought that was a myth too. Well, that was real. Well, we got these pyramids in Egypt, we got pyramids in South America. They gotta be connected. What could have connected them? Atlantis, and the reason I think that this is not the reason, a reason why this is a baffling, kind of fascinating story full of folly is all these guys were relying on translation, because obviously these books were originally written in ancient Greek. And those translations, for hundreds of years, you can go back and they all say the same thing. There was a continent, islands in the Atlantic Ocean. Well, so let's fast forward to George Sarantitis, whose work I discovered quite by accident while on vacation on a Greek island in 2019.
Yeah, how did you find this guy?
Yeah, total accident. I was on the island of Santorini, which a lot of people probably know as one of the hypothetical inspirations for the Atlantis myth, because there was an ancient civilization there 3,600 years ago, so about 1600 BC, and it got destroyed by a massive volcanic eruption. And you can go there today, and you can go to the dig site. There's a place called Akrotiri, and you'll see this wonderful ancient ruin. They've unearthed a huge section of it that had been buried under like 20 or 30 feet of volcanic ash, right?
Wow.
And this is why Santorini has its ring shape today, is that the center of the island was a volcano and it blew up, right? So I'm there checking out Akrotiri. My wife and I are staying at a hotel. I think we're waiting for a cab to go somewhere to dinner or something. Bookcase in the lobby, lots of books. I'm not paying attention. I'm checking for my Uber or whatever it is. And my wife's like, hey, check this out. Just pulls the book off the shelf. And uncharacteristically, I hadn't brought anything to read with me. So I'm like, all right, what is this? And I take a look. It says the Atlantis Conference 2008. And I thought to myself, there was an academic conference about Atlantis? Like, what planet am I on right now? But this really happened. It took place in the Mediterranean. And, I'm sitting by the pool, just like leafing through this in my spare time. Most of it was nonsense. But I get to these papers by this guy named George Sarantitis, who's a Greek researcher. He lives in Athens. And, I'm a pretty well classically educated guy. I love history and I'm no philosophy. So I'm reading through. I'm like, okay, yeah, Plato, this, that. Okay, yeah. All right, this. Wait, I thought, holy Toledo. This guy might have actually cracked the greatest historical mystery of mankind.
Wow.
it just hit me like a ton of bricks. And I almost couldn't believe it.
He's got this unique approach, doesn't it? He calls it the methodology of mythology approach to what he claims are hidden layers in Plato's commentaries. What is this approach?
Yeah, so this approach, actually I've got a book right here, which I'll just flash on screen. I'm not getting paid for this. Philosophy Between the Lines by a guy named Arthur Meltzer, who is a retired professor, I think from Michigan or Michigan State. And that's to say that this is about the history of esoteric writing. And I tried to explain this to some people. I'm not sure they quite get it, but basically in our modern era, we're in a very what I'm going to call one word, one meaning kind of world, right? And everybody's arguing over what words mean, and it's very clear. Like if I say you're a chump, there's no room for irony. There's no room for subtlety. I just said you're a chump, right? And that's the end of the story. But prior to about 200 years ago, there's a long, almost the entirety of philosophy as we know it, there's this history of what's called esoteric writing. Esoteric just means kind of the inner or the more secretive. Exoteric means kind of the outer or for the public consumption, right?
Yeah.
And so a good example of this that I can think of in the modern era is like The Wizard of Oz. I don't know if you're familiar with the classic film, but you watch it in your kid and you're like, oh, it's about a girl and her dog, and there's a lion and there's a tin man, and they're going on a fun adventure. But apparently, I think that this was actually like some kind of parable about the gold standard in U.S. currency discussions.
Oh my gosh.
And William Jennings Bryan or something. There's a sort of hidden meaning in there.
Really?
So if you were around, I mean, I might be getting the era wrong, but there's definitely stuff like that. Another thing is like Gulliver's Travels, right? I think a lot of people probably read this in high school. He's going on this mission and he is sailing around the road. This guy, Gulliver, winds up in different places, and there's some deep irony toward his own society. So that's all to say that the history of literature, and particularly of philosophy, there's these kind of at least two layers, sometimes multiple layers of meaning. And this was well understood kind of until the last couple hundred years with the Enlightenment. And then our thinking, our reading changed.
That's fascinating. So the basic idea is that there's a surface layer of Plato's writing. This is what the normal person understands, but the true meaning is hidden unless it's an initiate. Someone who's been initiated into that type of thinking, that type of education. There's almost a code to understanding it, correct?
That's absolutely right. And this is exactly what George Sarantitis was sort of saying. And his idea, methodology of mythology, which he had published in papers and presented at conferences and stuff about 15 or 20 years ago, is sort of, look, George was trained as an engineer. He studied ancient Greek in high school and maybe in college, and he is what I'll call an amateur history and philosophy buff, right? So he loved the ancient world, and I think it bothered George that Plato, his favorite philosopher, is like his hero, and he's like, why is this guy writing fairy tales? Like it's stuck in his craw, It just didn't make sense to him, and he thought, let me go back and read this stuff. And he really started looking into mythology, and he's like, I really think that there's more here. And this is not the only subject George has addressed. He's looked back at like the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he's sort of solved problems or quirks or sort of unanswered questions. And I'll give you a quick example. In the Odyssey, there's Odysseus' son Telemachus is sort of out sailing around the Ionian Sea, and there's some bad guys who are going to try and jump it. And they're hiding out in a boat, like behind what's described as a star-shaped island. Look on the map today, there is no star-shaped island in the Ionian Sea. Well, was Homer just making this up? Was this some weird symbolic thing? And George kind of refused to believe this. And George has a vacation home in one of the Ionian Islands, and he has a sailboat, and he's been sailing around there a long time. And he's like, listen, there's no star-shaped island here. Let's go check it out. So he did a little research, and he realizes that sea levels were like 3-4 meters lower in the Bronze Age. Not a lot, but a little bit, And he goes and looks up these naval charts of the Ionian Sea. Boom, off the coast of Kefalonia, there's a rocky outcropping that's kind of star-shaped, and it would have been above water, perfect size to hide a small ship behind.
Incredible.
Case closed. So
That's
this
incredible.
is the kind of detective work this guy does, is he looks at climate change, he looks at language, he looks at literature, and he eliminates the impossible, and he refuses to believe that it's nonsense. And he said, no, there's something here.
It's interesting as well that he's an outsider in terms of this isn't his main academic pursuit. You said he's been an engineer his entire life. We've been finding it's often the outsiders who make the breakthroughs in, well, really the dogma that's been set in for years. He's coming in with a fresh perspective. He's not really, tied down by any conventional restraints in thinking. And we learned from the documentary, it's really the different language translations of Plato's commentaries that are the key to his first kind of unlocking of this mystery. You mentioned that as he's reading through the different translations, he started to discover that all the meanings are different.
So this is one of the most shocking parts of this whole story, and I fact-checked all this. It's all true. So Sarantitis goes back to the Atlantis myth. He digs up all the best English and modern Greek translations of Plato, Timaeus and Critias, and he starts reading them. And one of the first things that struck him is they all say, blah, 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 this place was in the Atlantic. You have to cross the Atlantic Ocean to get there. He says, wait a minute. Then he looks at the ancient Greek, which he also has, and he says, it doesn't say Atlantic Ocean. It says Atlantic Pelagos. And for those who don't speak ancient Greek, a pelagos is a body of water like the Aegean Sea. And that's what modern Greeks actually still call the Aegean Sea. It's called the Aegean Pelagos, right? The Ionian Sea is the Ionian Pelagos. Okay, so first off, right off the bat, it doesn't say Okeanos anywhere in Timaeus and Critias. Plato was not ignorant of the word Okeanos, which means ocean. He uses it in other books he's written, so it's not like he was just ignorant. He knew it was there. It's not what he meant. And Plato is a real stickler for grammar and word choice. And you might expect this thing. I mean, just think about your college English professor. I mean, that guy was probably a stickler for word choice and grammar. Let's talk about one of the greatest thinkers of humanity. You think this guy is just vague with his language?
Just hold up for a second here. So what he's discovered, this is what you're saying. There is no mention of Atlantis being in the Atlantic Ocean in the original text.
Correct. It does. It's not what it says. It's not what it says.
That's mind-blowing. This changes everything. I mean, you point out in the documentary, those early researchers like Donnelly, it totally, destroys their ideas. So how did George go about resolving this? I mean, we see him doing some retranslating. Don't tell us he had to retranslate all of Plato's commentaries.
George is nothing if not thorough. I've gotten to know him quite well. That's exactly what he did. He said, wait a minute, F this. I can't count on these translations. I got to go back to the original text. Now, again, for George, this is like going back to, I studied Latin in high school and college. It's like going back to something. So he himself is not the world's greatest philologist. So he hired a philologist and had from a university in Athens and had him check his work to make sure that he wasn't dreaming things up or misidentifying grammar. And his whole idea, and he basically went on this quest and he said, you know what? I think this whole story is written deliberately as a puzzle that you have to try and figure out. And all of a sudden, the whole thing, it's like it just opens up, right? I mean, I felt like it's a little bit like, spoiler alert for people who never saw the original Planet of the Apes with Charlton Heston. But at the end, he's on the beach on a horse, and he sees a ruined Statue of Liberty. And all of a sudden, this cosmic horror hits him, and he realizes, my God, I'm on Earth. The Planet of the Apes is the Earth while I was gone in space.
it got taken over by talking apes. So this is the kind
But that's what it was like for you.
This is what it's like. I was like, oh my God, this is a puzzle. This is deliberately set up this way. I want to point out that George's theory about mythology and Plato's use of myth squarely lines up with conventional academic thinking about Plato's writing. He's known for using puzzles. He's known for tricking people. He's known for setting logical traps. He's known for making things confusing. And he's known for creating layers of meaning. And you can, honestly, I encourage people, just go to like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy online and read an article about Plato. Not making this up.
Yeah. Well, this is where the tone of the film really started to set in. And as I was watching the documentary, at first I'm like, okay, I've seen a million Atlantis documentaries. I know where this is going. But it got to this point and I was just in because I realized that George was something special. He had found a puzzle that perhaps no one else had understood, or perhaps no one's understood for hundreds of years. And this unraveling was just really fascinating to watch. So we see one of the first things mentioned is that as George is doing this translation, he points out that the meanings start to change. When he goes back to the original Greek, that example you gave of there's no mention of the Atlantic Ocean in the original, you can see how the meaning would start to change within the sentences, within the paragraphs. And one of the first clues that's brought forward from this retranslation is the Pillars of Heracles. First of all, for us uninitiated, bring us back to this description of the Pillars of Heracles. Why are they important, and how is this the first clue to actually finding and unlocking the puzzle from Plato?
This is a fantastic question, Ben, because a lot hinges on this, and I actually am not sure we do a perfect job of explaining this in the film, but it goes something like this, right? In the Platonic dialogues, and people always say Plato wrote or Plato said. Plato didn't say anything. He's created a story where characters are talking to each other, right? So it's not that Plato wrote down, hey guys, Atlantis is here, P.S. Love ya, Plato, right? That's not what it is, right? It's contained in the frame of the story. So keep that in mind. The characters say relating the story, well, you have to sail through the Pillars of Heracles across an Atlantic pelagos. Then you're going to pass some islands and some other, kind of wetland island areas, and you're going to wind up in an Atlantic Pontos. That's a different type of sea. Then from there's another Atlantic pelagos, maybe a thalassa, which is another type of sea. And then you're going to get to this ringed capital city, which is the Atlantean capital city. And that's how you get there, right? And the other key piece I want to mention here is in some of these older translations, they're confusing as hell because they sort of conflate the continent island, which is supposed to be kind of the big part, a smaller kind of pointy island, which is sort of supposed to be in the middle of the continent. It doesn't really explain how. And then within that, there's an area called the center of all, which is this ringed capital city, which is sort of set into this pointy Atlantis island, which is in the Atlantis island continent, right? So if you were to, so what George did was he sort of questioned, and he sort of create this schematic diagram. He's like, all right, got to go past the Pillars of Heracles. Heracles and Hercules are the same guy, for those who don't know. Got to go past the Pillars of Heracles. Got to cross a body of water called an Atlantic Pelagos. Got to get to an Atlantic Pontos. Got to go down, seemingly away from Greece in this direction, and we got to, we're going to eventually wind up at this city. He said to himself, "Oh, P.S. The whole thing about Atlantis being longer than Asia and Libya in length. This is another point where George, being classically educated, it dawned on him that this exact phrase almost is in Herodotus, who is known as the father of history. He wrote about a generation before Plato. And Herodotus uses almost that same phrase when he's describing the length of Europe. Now this means something, right? Because people are like, oh, Asia didn't mean the same thing that it means. today. The length of Libya and Asia. Well, what did that mean, right? Put those two together. That means that whatever that sum is has to be the same length as the length of Europe. And Herodotus, I think, chops it off somewhere out near like Azerbaijan or something like that, right? So that's sort of his distance. Well, lo and behold, George is like, well, I've got a schematic. Where am I going to find this place? And he's ruling out sunken continents because that's not what the ancient Greek says. He's ruling out fantasy. He's ruling out transdimensional portals, right? He's saying this has got to be somewhere,
Yeah.
right? Where on earth could this be? Well, you and I both know, and if you Google it today, the Pillars of Heracles are said to be in basically the Strait of Gibraltar, right?
Yeah, that's the traditional idea.
That's where it is today. It is no other place. That's where it is, but that's not where it always was. And I want you to, if you go back, audience, with us in time, as the Greek world expanded in its seafaring knowledge, and they had their hero, Heracles, the idea was Heracles had gone out and had adventures to the ends of the known world. Well, as your known world starts to expand, the Pillars of Heracles could be at different locations. And if you go back to different authors, you're going to find the Pillars of Heracles are mentioned as being at different places. The other thing is, right around Herodotus's era, they'd kind of been narrowed down to, okay, they're probably in the Strait of Gibraltar region. But if you go back and read these ancient authors, some of which I have, you realize that nobody had a damn clue what they were talking about. Some guys thought that they were islands. Some guys thought that they were actual physical pillars, like of a building. Other people thought they were like mountains. So George realized all this, right? And he said to himself, wait a minute. Plato might be referencing a different location for the pillars. And I think this is the thing that maybe we don't get across in the film. I don't think Plato was saying, well, Herodotus thinks the pillars are somewhere other than the Strait of Gibraltar. I think Plato is playing with the idea that nobody actually knows where the hell they are, right? It's just a term that's by sort of accretion has wound up, kind of like we're talking about with the overall myth today. The Pillars of Heracles just kind of wound up at the Strait of Gibraltar because by a certain point in time, no one knew where else to put them.
And they really are the key, aren't they? Because once we find the pillars, that gives us the starting point for Plato's map, for lack of a better word. This journey, the story of a ship from, I always said Herodotus, but you're correcting my pronunciation. Herodotus.
Yeah.
In Herodotus's writings, he talks about this ship blown off course. And forgive me, I can't remember all the details, but it ends up in Tartessus. Where's Tartessus?
So this is another great aspect of this, which just shows that very few people have any damn idea what they're talking about. So we've recently decided that Tartessus was a place in southern Spain based on some historical references, such as Herodotus, right? But Sarantitis took umbrage with this because he says, look, this ship set sail. They was from the island of Samos, and they were going to Egypt to trade in the Nile Delta, and they got blown off course. So then they say, okay, let's get our act together. We're going to try and go back to the Delta. Huge storm blows in the opposite direction. So they're now heading westward, all the way through the sea, never touching land, through the Pillars of Heracles, and they wind up in Tartessus. Well, George is a sailor, and he's been sailing like his whole life. So he suddenly just something didn't sit right with him. He said, wait a minute, these guys were in Libya. The average length of a maximum storm in the Mediterranean is like 3-4 days. He knows how fast ancient ships could move. I mean, you can look this up, right? There are estimates of how far they could go, and it's like a few miles an hour, right? And what he realizes is that if these guys really made this journey, first of all, they had to go hundreds of kilometers north, and they had to go like 1,000 kilometers westward. And these guys are skilled sailors, and they didn't hit land anywhere in that time. They would have been blowing for like 15 or more days, like 20 days or more.
It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make any sense. So what he said is, okay, the Pillars of Heracles might have been considered to be in more than one place at this time, which we know from going back to different texts. It's true. I mean, even I just went back and looked at Tacitus, who's a Roman historian from 500 years later. He reports that people say there's Pillars of Heracles at a river mouth in northern Germany, right? So again, I want to be clear that this is sort of a vague notion, which is only solidified kind of more in modernity since the time of Plato, right? Since the time of Herodotus. So basically, George looks at the map and he's like, well, if I was blowing due west in a ship and I was going to go maybe 5-6 days, where would I hit? You know? And boom, he says, okay, it's, I'm going to wind up in the Gulf of Gabes in modern day Tunisia. And so he says, this has got to be where the Pillars of Heracles were. Only problem, Ben, is where's the damn giant Atlantic Sea that's supposed to be there, right? Once you go through the pillars, there's got to be a huge body of water.
Well, is there anything about this area in Africa? Is there anything about Tunisia that would correlate with Plato's descriptions thousands of years ago? Because now we've got to go back into ancient climate records and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, and this is where I had to spot check this because this was news to me, right? And a lot of people probably going to be familiar with something called the Green Sahara, right? So the Green Sahara is a real thing. It's non-controversial. Every 20,000 years or so, these things called, now I'm about to nerd out on you, Milankovitch cycles change like the obliquity of the Earth's orbit and kind of the tilt of our axis. And these things contribute to natural climate change, right? So basically what happens is like there's this 20,000 year cycle in the Sahara Desert where the monsoons shift from, very wet areas like the Congo, they start to shift northward. So they start to bring a lot of precipitation to the southern Sahara. It's also been identified that probably the Mediterranean monsoon belt, for whatever reason, shifts south around concurrently. So what you get is all of a sudden in a place that was very dry for a long time now becomes wet very quickly. And it's like a not a vicious, it's maybe a virtuous circle where you have more moisture and then that moisture can kind of evaporate and then you get more rain. And then you get more moisture and you get rivers starting. And then they create lakes and then the lakes create more, evaporation. So it happens there's debate over this, but it seems like it happens relatively quickly, like an area the size of.
There is almost a flip in terms of, relatively speaking, it's not a 1,000-year change. It's a rather quick shift.
It could be. It depends on where you are, right? If you're in the mountains, right, you're going to get more precipitation. If you're out on a flat desert plain, you're going to get less. So it's not uniform, right?
But the bottom line is, in the ancient past, the Sahara was lush. It was green. It was beautiful. 100%. There was water everywhere.
100%, and this is non-controversial. And I'd encourage people who want to, dive into this to go to a website called ResearchGate and type in, Green Sahara, and there will be dozens of papers on this, right?
Well, my favorite example, I'm not going to read those papers. The best example you gave was the crocodiles. You gave this example of the crocodiles in the middle of the desert. I thought that was fascinating. Yeah. Right in the middle of the Sahara, surrounded by desert, there's this little pool of crocodiles. How did they get there? How did they survive?
It blew my damn mind because, listen, there's alligators all throughout the southeastern United States, and I live in the desert, and I haven't seen any lately, right? So what that tells you is alligators probably didn't live around here. But when you find crocodiles living in a watery cave in the middle of the damn desert in a giant country like Mauritania, you got to scratch your head. Well, where'd they come from? Well, during the Green Sahara, waterways of a vast, like we're talking like the size of Australia or the United States, vast area was like, think of modern, maybe like Kenya or something. If you're on safari there, you got trees, you got grasslands, and you got, giraffes running around and elephants and stuff like that. Right. So this was a totally different world. And during this time, there were what were called mega lakes. And now we get to something where we start to put modern climate science and classical research together. And guess what we find out? Guess where there was a gigantic mega lake probably around the time Plato is estimating, maybe a few thousand years plus or minus, but around that era, right in the middle of Tunisia. And guess where it emptied out? Right in the Gulf of Gabes.
Oh, wow.
So, and this is another tricky place where you got to hunt for these little clues. The story says, at that time, the time of the Atlantis conflict, 9,600 BC, the Atlantic Pelagos was navigable. Well, if we were talking about the Atlantic Ocean, the Strait of Gibraltar hasn't been closed for like 5 million years.
Yeah, it
right?
must be somewhere else. Yeah.
So it can't be the Atlantic Ocean. And then people are like, the Greeks didn't know about the Atlantic Ocean. I'm like, this is a case of modern people thinking that we know better than what ancient people are telling us. And sure as shit, I mean, the Phoenicians had explored. We know they had explored outside the Strait of Gibraltar. There's the Hanno, the navigator, and I believe his name was Himilco, went on journeys up to northern Europe and down the coast of Africa. And we know this, and because there's Carthaginian ruins in like Morocco and places like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Let's talk about that for a second, because when we're talking about this Atlantean empire of sorts, this huge civilization, the original descriptions talk about that they were a seafaring nation. They had, 12,000 ships in the navy, 1 million man army, like really insane numbers. Is there archaeological evidence that supports this kind of large-scale seafaring that far into the past?
So in the film, in the Atlantis Puzzle, we spend a lot of time kind of digging into the true versus false aspects of this story. Like, what do we know from modern archaeology and climate science? So we know that there were huge lakes. We know that they were in Africa, basically where they should be, if the story was quote unquote true. We also know that probably there's some wiggle room here, right? Plato may not be saying it's entirely true. We don't really know. Okay, what is the truth behind stuff like international trade, or what is the architecture, or as you mentioned, things like warfare and seafaring? Well, as it turns out, some of the things are definitely false, right? Like, we have no evidence that people were using metals and stuff like that far back, right? Back 12,000 years ago. That's when metal use kind of starts, but it's not like a widespread phenomenon. It's like people with like little copper beads and like, little arrow tips and stuff like that. So that part, probably not true. This is the part, though, that blew my mind, is the seafaring part, because I thought this is one of the parts that was definitely going to turn out to be false. I was wrong. I was dead wrong. Turns out that you got to think about this, because boats are usually made out of wood or bamboo or, perishable materials.
Yeah, they're going to rot.
They're going to rot. The oldest boat in the world is this thing called the Pessa canoe. It was dug up from a peat bog in Netherlands, by accident, right? Guys building a road and they dug up this log and they say, hey, that log looks like a canoe. Guess what? That's what it is. And that's the oldest boat. It's about 10,000 years old.
Right.
So it was only preserved by like this freak accident. So I think some people are like, oh, maybe it was some genius, some Leonardo da Vinci of the ancient world figured this out. I don't think so, because ancient people are tribal. If you got a wooden canoe, why wouldn't you share that knowledge with me? And then we all got canoes and we can all go fishing, right? So we also find this in Africa. There's this thing called the Dufuna canoe, which got dug up in Nigeria by like a random dude who was out digging a well. And, I just find this story so amusing, because it just goes to show, like, if that guy had not dug that well at that spot, and if that boat had not been covered by clay, well, ancient African water travel might have remained speculation. But now, because they dug up this like 30-foot long canoe, we know that people were paddling around in huge canoes, not that different, most likely, from canoes that were observed in like the 1800s.
All that does is make me think, how much have we not discovered? If it's that one in a billion chance that guy dug up that canoe and that's all we understand of ancient African navigable seaways or waterways, what else is yet to be discovered? But this was a great example because this you also paired this with examples all around the world. I really love this part of the documentary. You went as far afield as research in the United Kingdom showing that ancient people had remains of wheat, but the wheat wasn't even from the European mainland, was it?
Yeah, this also blew my mind because in the Atlantis myth it says there were people in the harbors trading from all over, right? So this idea that people were trading from all across continents and things like that 11,600 years ago sounds like total BS. And the issue, I would have liked to have had a better example from North Africa, but the part of the problem is most of the Sahara is not that well studied. And so, there are some sites that people have found and so forth. But if you want to we had to kind of look a little further afield, for example. So I wanted something in the Stone Age, something that would be kind of comparable, right? Well, there's a great site off the coast of the UK. It's underwater today, but it would have been on land at the time. And excuse me, this site, they found ancient wheat species. And the baffling thing is, farming wasn't supposed to really have gotten going in the UK, and certainly people weren't supposed to be growing wheat at this time. So they thought, well, maybe it was just early. But then they looked at the DNA of the species, I guess, and they said, wait a minute, these wheat species have no ancestors in Northern Europe. Where did this come from? Well, it turns out they have ancestors in the Middle East. Conclusion, continent-spanning trade networks
must have got there somehow.
In the Stone Age. I mean, even if a dude, was traveling and he, ate a bread sandwich or whatever, and it fell in his backpack, it still had to get there somehow. So that blew my mind as well. So I'm like, okay. And by the way, where I live in New Mexico, there's a sacred dance of this native people called the turtle dance, and I've witnessed this before, and these guys have these turtle shells strapped to their knees, and it's this whole ritualistic thing. Guess what? Those turtle shells don't live in New Mexico.
Yeah,
they
right.
traded for those shells like way down the Rio Grande into Mexico.
That's
like
fascinating.
1,000 miles or whatever. And that's more recent, right? That's probably in the last couple thousand years. But
we covered a recent one on an episode. I might be getting the Native American tribe wrong, but I think it was the Hopi, who have a specific dance to call in the rain. And it's their shamanic dance, and the depiction of it is holding two snakes. And you're holding two snakes and you're doing this dance. Well, we discovered that this is identical to I think it's the Shang dynasty, perhaps the earliest dynasty in China, one of the first, that has the exact same shamanic dance for the exact same purpose, and it's depicted as a guy dancing holding two snakes. And so clearly the ancient world was hyper-connected in culture and in trade. And, you really found some fantastic examples. I loved is it the Shistu Cave, where they're finding these obsidian tools? Tell us about that.
This is another thing that kind of blew my mind because, I was thinking about this whole seafaring and trade thing. I mean, this is one of the aspects to me of the story that's the most fantastical, right? And lo and behold, I mean, first of all, was anyone even living in Athens in 9600 BC, right? I mean, it certainly wasn't a city-state the way we think of it in Plato's era, right? Well, I actually went out to this cave, Shistu Cave, which is like located on a random hillside outside of Athens. You have to go like miles down like a gravel road. And I get out there and you can't even, it's hard to find. And I get out there and there's people been leaving offerings there for, hundreds, if not thousands of years. Well, it turns out that in this cave, they found stone tools from, as far back as 10, 11, 12,000 BC. And at other sites around Greece in similar type of caves. Well, the crazy thing about this is not that the tools were like hyper advanced or that, anything was super fishy or that people were living there. What's weird is that all these tools come from an island in the center of the Aegean Sea called Milos. And that is a little baffling because even though sea levels were lower when you go back 10, 12,000 years ago, most of these islands were still not part of the mainland. So even if the distances you had to cross were 10, 20 kilometers, it's still too far to swim, right? And why are you going to swim out there and put a whole bunch of rocks on your back and swim back? I mean, you're not going to, right? So what it suggests is that people were trading around the Aegean Sea, long distances by water, several thousand years before the events of the Atlantis.
Yeah. I love this
Yeah.
example. It's this little island making all the technology for the surrounding area. It kind of reminded me of Taiwan making everyone's microchips. It's like the same idea. This little island making all this technology.
Ben, in 10,000 years, they're going to be telling the same story about us. They're like, oh, they got their silicon from one place,
Yeah, it's bizarre. And Plato clearly spoke about the layout of the city of Atlantis as well. And this is brilliant because George, he does this great geographical measuring and interpreting of the text. And there's these brilliant diagrams of the actual layout that appears in Plato's story. And so now we're looking at this area in West Africa. We've got to ask the question, is there anywhere geographically that would match these descriptions from Plato? Is there any structure? Is there anything that gets close to it? Or are we just shooting in the dark here?
Yeah, and this is another head scratcher, right? Where once you kind of clear away the BS and the nonsense, you're sort of still left with some real mysteries, right? So there is a place, sure enough, right in the middle of West Africa, exactly where it should be according to the story, that is about 40 kilometers wide. It consists of concentric ringed ridges and valleys, which we know were at one time filled with water because they found freshwater fossils there. And we know people lived there because they found stone tools. It's called the Rashat structure. And this has been going around the internet like crazy for like the last 5-6 years.
I thought this was a meme. I didn't think there was anything to this at all. I thought this was just some kind of coincidence, that there's no way that this structure could have anything to do with Atlantis. And here's George, this brilliant researcher, making clearly the best argument for its connection I've ever seen.
Yeah, and the thing is that George did this 15 or 20 years ago. Like, he far preceded any of this stuff. And I've read his papers, right? And I mean, like I said, I read the papers in the 2008 Atlantis conference book, which means that he wrote them before 2008, right? So, because that's one of the things I thought about. I was like, well, a lot of people have this stuff out on social media, and they're like, yeah, look, Rashat, that's Atlantis' capital city. I know, I'm smart. P.S. I'm graduating high school next week, and I'm like, I feel like it's a little bit like people. It's like when you're taking calculus in high school, and you're sort of looking at the corner of your eye at your neighbor, and he's got 5 as the answer, so you write down 5, and then you're like, look, I'm smart. Me solve problem. It's like, well, that's why you show your work, right? And George has shown his work, and he was clearly the first person since he did this. Yeah.
This is the Rashat structure, and I'll put up some images in post here showing this, but this is in the Sahara Desert in Mauritania, 40 kilometers in diameter, concentric rings. And what was Plato's description? It was the island housing the main temple, the central island. The layout included 3 rings of water, 2 rings of land connected by bridges and fortified walls, towers, and gates. A great canal linked the outermost ring to the sea. So there's this great part in your film where you take George's geographical diagrams. And of course, this is such a trope in like an Indiana Jones movie or some kind of archaeological mystery where you get the layout of the map and you put it over something else and it all matches up. It was this perfect moment where it does match up, doesn't it?
It does. And here we have the mystery, right? Because what's a chance that I make up a myth with extremely specific measurements and geometry and stuff, and then lo and behold, we from 9,000 years before my time, and then lo and behold, thousands of years later, it's discovered that this matches up exactly. I mean, that it doesn't. The chances are zero, right? You don't get. I mean, if and here's the other thing. Why is it so specific in the story, right? Well, two reasons, I think. One, I think it's hard. It's almost safe to say Plato had knowledge of the Rashad. And here we go with a real life mystery. How did he know what the measurements were? They're extremely accurate, right? I mean, it's not to the millimeter, but plus or minus 5%. He's got it, right? So the question is, here we are in Mauritania at the Adrar Plateau at the Rashad structure, and it looks just like this ringed city. How the heck did a guy living in Athens, Greece, find out about something on the other side of the African continent?
I've got to bring up this glaring issue. Plato wrote about the sinking. It's the sinking of Atlantis. It disappeared overnight. And here we have this possible candidate for being the location of the city, this Rashad structure in Africa. Is there any evidence to suggest that this could have been a reality? I mean, how could a place in the middle of this area in Africa be flooded, covered overnight? How could this possibly happen?
Yeah, and you're going to see a lot of stuff out there in like social media and fringe theorists and stuff being like, oh yeah, the seas must have been hundreds of meters higher, or Africa was lower and it was all flooded, And I'm thinking to myself, guys, like this isn't real. You can't just make stuff up, right? So first off, Sarantitis knows this. He knows that the energy of a tsunami is not enough to sink a continent, right? And that continents do sink, right? There are real sunken areas of land masses around the world, but they sink over very long periods of time, right? It takes thousands of years. They don't sink, and they're not even sinking. The sea level's rising. So in this case, Western Africa was never, asterisk, I'll get back to this, was never under the water. This part of Mauritania wasn't under the water, but there was a lot of water there. There were a lot of lakes there. There was a lot of water in the Rashad. There was water around the edge of the Adrar Plateau. And you can see this just looking on like Google satellites or whatever. You can see the runoff, right? I mean, it's clear, that these were not recently created, channels of rivers. That this is a long time ago, right? So you got a lot of water. You got it rolling in from kind of a plateau down to a sort of basin city area, the Rashad, these rings, which already has water in it. So one of the things George looked at, he said, okay, well, maybe something's off here. And sure enough, he went back to the grammar and he's like, there's multiple meanings to these words, and it depends on grammar, right? So it's the same thing, that it goes back to the same trope of word usage and Greek grammar. Who thought Greek grammar was going to unlock the secret of Atlantis?
Yeah.
But study your Latin, kids. Study your ancient Greek. So what he realized was it doesn't say that the island continent sank overnight. It says something more like the island, the central sacred island, was flooded, was inundated. And then, the whole thing about the earthquakes and the army being covered by the earth, well, George interpreted that as liquefaction, which happens during earthquakes. And liquefaction is basically, this happened in Indonesia a few years ago, terrible earthquake where huge areas of land liquefy, like it becomes like quicksand and swallows up roads, and a lot of people died, right? They get sucked. They fell into the quicksand and they died a horrible death. Horrible death. So that's what George interpreted. So actually, in the film, we go to Oregon State University to say, look, nobody's saying a continent sank. Nobody's saying an island sank. But could a city have gotten flooded and been hit by an earthquake? And lo and behold, I talked to this earthquake expert, and that's a lot more realistic. I'd like to point out one. Yeah.
Dr. Scott Ashford, and he's got a giant wave machine out there, right, to
It's
simulate these
incredible.
ancient tsunamis. I thought that was fascinating.
We didn't put this footage into the film, so sorry everybody, but they have tested models of cities or buildings in this wave pool that's the size of a warehouse. I mean, it's the biggest machine I've ever seen. And when you're there and they generate this wave, you feel like you're about to get hit by a tidal wave. I mean, it's like that tidal wave that hit Southeast Asia a few years back, that was so devastating, right? So we kind of looked at that and said, okay, if a disaster really did happen here, you're not talking about the city as it's written in the myth. You're probably talking about Stone Age hunter-gatherers living in mud huts and stuff like that. Okay, who's to say there wasn't a settlement there, right? There have been a lot of stone tools uncovered around the Rashat from this time period, right? Early Holocene, late Pleistocene. And, we know there were freshwater, fish and stuff there. We got our crocodiles living in Mauritania. I mean, we know there was a very watery environment here. You could imagine, and this is where, again, the question comes up, was there really some disaster that was recorded in myth? And this myth found its way across Carthaginian trade routes or trans-Saharan trade routes to Egypt or to Carthage, and Plato or somebody heard about it. Maybe. There's a great example I'd just like to throw in, which is in the United States and in Canada, in the Pacific Northwest, there's a myth about a tremendous flood that took place in the distant past. And the flood was so bad that people only survived because they tied their canoes to trees, and when the water level rose, they were able to survive. Well, everybody always thought that this is a myth because these simple savages, didn't know anything, and they had this
Mm-hmm.
silly myth about a flood. Well, it turns out there's a lot of evidence that this actually took place, and Scott Ashford was familiar with this. What they did is they went back in time and they realized that they were trying to put a date to this. So they went back, and it occurred that in a Tokyo, like a Japanese newspaper from like 300 years ago, there was an article about a tsunami that had hit without an earthquake. What that means is that the wave was generated somewhere way out in the ocean because it didn't shake the Japanese mainland. This tsunami, as it turns out, ties in with evidence of huge coastal flooding in the Pacific Northwest of North America at that time. Lo and behold, this is now like not a super controversial thing. It seems that myth and reality tied together. And the fact that Dr. Ashford was familiar with this, it's probably why they let me in the building, right? I mean, guy shows up wanting to make a movie about Atlantis, and usually you get escorted to the door, rather unceremoniously.
We've got the same examples in Australia. There's ancient Aboriginal myths of flooding up in the north of the country, and same thing. This was always thought to be, perhaps just a story that's been passed down, but recently there's been archaeological evidence found that these floods were absolutely happening, and the myths of the natives were the perfect record-keeping tool, which I guess gets us into the final act of the documentary, because it seems as though Plato understood that there was something powerful in the myth in terms of retaining information, passing on information, keeping things perhaps unchanged to a certain degree. And you mentioned that George, he discovered that Plato was doing more than just telling a story, obviously, that there was this extra layer of information for the initiate. And really there was a puzzle that needed to be solved almost beyond this idea of Atlantis. There was something else in here. And I thought this whole section was so fascinating. I didn't see the documentary going in this direction, but we ultimately learn with Plato's commentaries that, of course, is the Critias, that it just suddenly stops, and this has always been thought of as some kind of like mistake, like Plato just forgot to finish it, or one day he just stopped writing it and walked away. But George realized that this was actually perhaps on purpose, that Plato left it where it ended for a very specific reason. Can you speak to that a little bit and this code that was slowly uncovered?
Yeah, and I think I'm going to have people wait to watch the film to get into that particular juicy bit.
I
But
thought
I'll
you
tell
might
you
say
what,
that.
when I first read Sarantitis' book, which I actually have over here on my desk, I thought that this was a little far-reaching. I'm like, wait a minute, I've read multiple translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey. I didn't remember anything about this. And sure enough, there are connections that Plato's making, and it seems like the book was left quote unquote unfinished. It's not unfinished. It does cut off mid-sentence, but it seems like shocker, Plato was not too lazy to finish this story. Instead, there's a sort of commentary here about, I'm going to say, lost knowledge about the ancient past. Today, Ben, there's groups like the Memory of Mankind Project or the Long Now Foundation you might have heard of, people who are concerned about essentially kind of creating time capsules and the continuity of knowledge that could extend thousands of years in the future in case, there's a nuclear war or climate change disaster, whatever, right? They're concerned with record keeping and the continuity of society. Well, I think Plato may have been the first thinker to introduce this concept. And I'll kind of maybe end on this note that you remember we were talking about the story where Solon's in the temple and he's talking about the ancient past, the Greeks now. And the Egyptians are laughing up their sleeve because they know better because they got the records. And the Egyptian priest says, listen, you Greeks, every time you have a big disaster, your civilization gets wiped out and you guys got to start over from like basic subsistence. You lose everything. Then this actually happened. And the Greeks knew that something like this had happened. How? Well, the people of the Iliad and the Odyssey were this sort of semi-mythical people. Those are real people from the Mycenaean era, right? This really took place, right? The Trojan War era. Well, Greece had writing for maybe around 2000 BC for a long time, right? When the Mycenaean era collapsed, right around the time of the Trojan War, a little bit after, 12th century BCE, writing was lost. Right, you probably heard of Linear A and Linear B. Linear B is this law. These languages became lost. The Greeks were more or less illiterate for like hundreds of years until writing was reinvented. And you know where the Greeks lifted that from? They borrowed it from the Phoenicians. Who are the Phoenicians? The founding people of Carthage. So the modern Greek alphabet that we know today came from a reinvention of language. So literally what Plato's saying, this discontinuity, this loss of civilization, this loss of record keeping, loss of knowledge, had actually happened. And then that hit me right between the eyes when I put these things together. I thought, my God, this guy set this whole thing up, this whole story about deep time, this whole story about thinking about the rise and fall of civilization. And he paired it with the other key thing, right? Two principles in Platonic thinking, right? What's a good life and what's a good society? Well, he's talking about what's a good society and the continuity of knowledge. But then what's a good life for the individual? Well, what makes you being a good thinker, right? Platonists love being good thinkers and, being thorough. Well, how do you become a really good thinker? And George's answer, methodology and mythology, is you have to decipher puzzles like the Atlantis puzzle. And I hope that this will inspire a lot of people to take an interest in philosophy, take an interest in the ancient world, and realize that there are so many wonderful layers of history, of thought, wars, adventures, all kinds of incredible stuff, incredible thinking. And it's all right there.
It really is a message that's pertinent as well, because we look at these cycles of time and we look at the collapse of a civilization and think, oh, what a great story, and that'll never happen to us. But it wouldn't take much for us to be in the same situation where a generation down in the future cannot read and write, and it's not a part of our civilization anymore, or there won't be a civilization anymore. It's very, very possible, and it's almost inevitable if you look at the cycle of history. I think there's a great lesson in there as well, and I like the moral lesson. And I just have to give you props for a fantastic film and for finding George's research and presenting this to the world, because it might not be accessible for so many people. Does he have any books in English that people can check out?
He has one. It was written a long time ago, and he himself acknowledges it needs a lot of updating. But because he was kind of pioneering all these ideas, you can only get it by kind of contacting him. And I think he's he may have cut off his email because he gets so many messages from, nut jobs. I mean, I could tell you some, like when I was filming this film in Greece, there was a guy living in the town where I was staying who told me that he was the descendant of Pelasgian kings who had battled Atlanteans, and he had this whole lineage, and he believed that he was the king of a rightful king of Greece, and he had big plans for his country and stuff like that.
That's your next documentary.
Oh God, there's so many nut jobs out there, but George Sarantitis is the opposite of a nut job. He's a fantastic amateur, call it philosopher, amateur researcher, and what I think of as a genuine philosopher, right? Because in the ancient world, like a philosopher wasn't just like a dude who liked like debating stuff and thinking about stuff any more than a saint is like a dude who likes religion, right? It's a different way of being, right? And I think Sarantitis is a real modern philosopher, right? He's a polymath. He's a person who knows a lot of different things, questions things, isn't satisfied with BS answers. And, I'm hopeful that I might be able to make future films that explore, controversial topics in a way that breaks them open, because the real mysteries, Ben, are every bit as exciting and interesting, I think, as the energy crystals, maybe not the secret UFOs death rays and the fishmen with laser blasters. I mean, that's pretty neat, but, I wish I had tried it too,
We always maintained, and we found at least maybe 8 or 9 sources over the years of doing our show that claim Atlantis was destroyed because the citizens started to genetically modify dinosaurs to have sex with them.
That's a classic downfall. I think that brought down the British Empire, didn't it?
Yeah. And we're repeating the same mistake today.
It's happening today. That's right.
Oh, again,
you heard it here first.
Thank you so much for joining us. And the Atlantis Puzzle is fantastic. You can check it out at atlantispuzzle.com. And of course, check out our show notes at mysteriousuniverse.org, and we'll list everywhere you can watch the film. And just thank you for giving us a window into George Sarantitis' research, because otherwise I think a lot of us just would never have come across it, and it is brilliant. So, Jack, thanks again.
100%. Thanks so much for having me today.
Huge thanks again to Jack for appearing on the show. Again, make sure you check out mysteriousuniverse.org for all the links to the Atlantis Puzzle. Again, their website is empirebuilderproductions.com. But just search for the film in Amazon, Google Play, YouTube, the usual places, and you'll find it. And I really enjoyed it, Aaron. I thought it was, again, something not as left of field, not left of field that we usually cover.
As I was expecting, yes.
It was really grounded in, solid archaeological research, whether it was the history of the climate in the region. I found it especially interesting. He was showing the different bands of the climate going north through Africa and essentially changing
the greening
Sahara. Of the Sahara. I thought that was fascinating.
Yep.
But the whole Rashat structure.
And isn't it incredible?
In the interview, I'm yelling at him saying, I thought this was a meme. I had no idea that there was anything to this. And it turns out it all comes back to George. Like, George was the guy that made this connection. And there's a great part in the film, which I include in the interview, where you overlay George's sketches, his diagrams.
And this was what, a 40-kilometer across circular structured city?
Yeah, well, I mean, city is the way it's described now, but, you know, it really made me rethink what it would mean to see this ancient seafaring civilization in this region. You know, we have the meme in our minds of glorious cities with metal everywhere and,
dinosaurs.
You know, highly advanced dinosaurs and flying crystals and things like that. But the reality was obviously likely a lot different. I thought it was really fascinating on that greening of the Sahara idea. I don't know if I showed it in the interview, but there's a map that shows all the waterways connecting the west of Africa all the way to Egypt, basically, and or even further east. And it kind of made sense as to why they would be a trade superpower.
Yeah, it's a trade route.
Because
it's easy.
Moving goods on water is like 100 times easier than over land.
Yeah.
If you've got all these navigable waterways, it would be such a huge economic advantage for whatever, you know, civilization is there.
And what was it as well? There's something I wrote down here where they found 8,000-year-old DNA from wheat, and it was in an area sort of to the north.
Yeah,
it was like mixing up with their trade route.
That's in the interview.
Yeah, right. I mean, that to me was actually quite compelling.
Yeah, and there's all these obsidian tools that are made on this one little island, and then you find them all over Europe.
In the interview with the Reshat structure, did you go into the stone structures that have been found there, some of the images?
A little bit. There's a lot more in the film.
Yeah.
But yeah, it seems as though there was certainly something there. And again, it's just this whole idea of, I just thought it was a silly meme.
Isn't this a great example, though, of how, and he says this at the very start of the documentary, that, you know, civilizations, and empires, like how many of them have sprung up and disappeared, and we have, you know, no history of them. The only information that we have about them is hidden within myth. And that's what, you know, George has done. He's looked at Plato's writings and has interpreted them in, you know, a less conventional kind of way, but has actually revealed something which demonstrates that, yeah, there may have been this barbaric, not advanced, a barbaric civilization there.
The big reveal for me was when he says, well, it never says Atlantic Ocean in the texts. It never mentions ocean.
Yeah.
And for hundreds of years, we've had this idea of it's a continent that was in the Atlantic Ocean and it sunk. That's completely out the window. And, you know, you'd have to go and rethink so much of the whole Atlantean mythos.
Pardon me. When you think about it logically as well, right? The whole idea that you could have this massive landmass just disappear in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean without geologists, you know, oceanographers, being able to find any evidence of it whatsoever. You know, it's like, come on. You know, it's really like, it makes sense now that, yeah, like it never was in the Atlantic Ocean. It has nothing to do with the Atlantic Ocean because it was on the west coast of Africa.
Yeah, and I thought the work from Scott Ashford he was from the University of Oregon with his big wave machine.
Yeah.
You know, that made a lot of sense. That all it would take would be some kind of geological impact.
Well,
some kind of big earthquake would send all that silt and
the super liquefied material.
Yeah, so that sounds scary.
Yeah, of course it does.
And of course that would be passed down as the city going under.
Yep.
It wasn't like it sunk. It was just covered in this. Well, I guess it kind of did sink.
In a way, though, it's kind of sad because there is a bit of fun in the whole idea that there was this highly advanced crystal-driven civilization in the middle of the Atlantic, and perhaps not the dinosaur part, but everything else, like it's intriguing. But look, the reality is that, yeah, there probably was an Atlantean civilization, but it's nowhere near as advanced as what we're led to believe.
Yeah, they were just very good at warfare, very powerful.
And good at trade.
Good at trade.
Good at, ocean faring.
And then the Athenians kicked their ass.
Yep.
Great message. It's a great lesson from history.
Look out for the Athenians.
So again, we'll link to everything in the show notes, mysteriousuniverse.org. Welcome to the new season, by the way. We forgot to mention that at the start of the show.
That's fine.
Brand new season. The Atlantis Puzzle, available now. Search for it in Amazon Prime. We hope you enjoy it. And a lot more coming up on this episode. Aaron, what's coming up in Plus?
Well, we're going to be going into the Foaminoids. These are fake humanoids that fit in with this greater scheme of what appears to be Men in Black, but not in the traditional sense that we know them as. Of course, they show up as these terrifying characters that threaten people and prevent them from releasing details about their UFO experiences. But if you look into a great deal of the literature, you find that the whole Men in Black phenomenon is throughout everything. It fits into every kind of facet and style of experience that people have in paranormal undertakings. But why? Why is that? And it appears it ties into this collective group of invisible beings that are messing with humanity.
What do you mean foaminoids? I thought you were saying foam.
Not foaminoids.
Like they're humanoids made of foam.
No, they're the fake humanoids. So but a lot of the time they're wearing plastic. So that will be revealed in the Plus extension coming up. We're also going to be talking about, we're going to carry on from Jay Parrow's work, where we're going to be talking about manifestations and that very strange Men in Black encounter that I was talking about on the last Plus show as well.
Awesome. Looking forward to that. Head to mysteriousuniverse.org/plus for all the details. Sign up today and you get access to the big extensions we do on these shows every single week. Plus members also get an exclusive show that comes out every Tuesday as well. We already kicked off a new season this Tuesday. You also get a higher quality MP3 version of the show, totally ad-free version of the show as well if you're on Plus. And of course, if you sign up for MU Max, you get access to our massive back catalogue going back 16, 17 years. It's all in there, mysteriousuniverse.org/plus. Sign up today, help support your favorite show. That's a wrap for this free edition of MU. Thanks for listening. If you're on Plus, stick around for the great stuff after the break. For everyone else, we'll catch you next week.